Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I've mentioned in the past that in God's providence, I've been something of a Forrest Gump in the evangelical world, that because of my relationship with my father and his influence and reach, I have been around for many of the biggest moments, and I have met and interacted with some of the biggest, most influential people. Well, I mentioned in another segment, Heroes You Never Heard Of, that when I was in high school, I was discipled by the Bible teacher at my school, whose name was Jerry Matitix. And Jerry came out of Gordon Conwell Seminary, very well committed to sound historical Protestant theology, but years later embraced Roman Catholicism, and not long after that took another turn to the right and has now become more Catholic than the Pope, denying that the Pope is sitting on St. Peter's throne, rejecting Vatican II, etc., etc. Well, Jerry's best friend when he was in seminary was a fellow that I've known since I was a kid. In fact, his wife used to babysit me when I was in kindergarten. His name is Scott Hahn. And if Jerry Matitix is relatively well known for being a convert to Roman Catholicism, Scott Hahn is the poster boy of those who are famous for that turn. And interestingly, Scott Hahn discipled me in college. So I went from being under the tutelage of Jerry Matitix in high school to being under the tutelage of Scott Hahn in college. And a year or two after I was out of college, both of them had come to embrace Roman Catholicism. Now, I mention all that because I'm doing a segment. Our ism for Tuesday is on Donatism. Now it makes sense to you why I'm talking about those guys. Well, not if you're not familiar with Donatism. The Donatist controversy happened around the time that Augustine was still on the earth, and it wrestled with this question. If a pastor performs the sacrament in your life and later on recants the faith, does that undo the efficacy, the power of the sacrament performed on you? You see, there was a time during this time frame of a level of persecution, and there were a number of priests who, fearful for their lives, renounced the Christian faith, and then left those who had been under the care of these folks wondering, well, does this put me out of the Christian faith? That's the man who baptized me, or that's the man who served me the Lord's Supper. That's the man who discipled me. And the Donatist camp were those who said, yeah, it means you haven't been baptized. You need to get baptized. It means that you're outside the camp. You need to get brought inside the camp. But Augustine wisely argued the other perspective. He wisely rejected Donatism. And Donatism is not something that we are called to embrace. Now, most Protestants don't have such a deep sacramental theology that we would be specifically concerned about whether or not the person who baptized us or served us the Lord's Supper, whether or not said person left the faith at some point in their life, or revealed that they actually were never a part of the faith, would be a better way to put it. We don't have that burden, but we do have the kind of burden that I'm talking about with respect to my own life. And the way I look at the influence of these two men, certainly I want to be on guard, and because I actually know, at least in the case of Scott Hahn, because my intersection with him was a little bit later in time, I know that he was in the midst of at least wrestling over the temptation to convert to Catholicism while he was discipling me. He did not reveal that to me. I don't know whether he revealed it to my friends. He had sort of gathered together a cadre of 10 young men and taught us a Bible study and ministered to us. And 8 of those 10 young men eventually converted to Rome. So I don't know if he was more open with them, or I don't know what was going on. I do know, however, that so when I look back again, I want to be careful and think, well, I don't want to swallow any of those kinds of bones. But I also can continue to look back with gratitude for both men and how God used both men in helping me mature in my faith. I don't take the position that everything that came through them was tainted, because God's at work. You know, the same thing is true, I don't know, about other things that have influence on us. We can listen to music. Just the other day, we had a relatively well-known Christian musician renounce the faith. And so there might be a number of people sort of wrestling with this Donatist perspective. Should I be concerned that I was listening to this man's songs? Is it a bad thing for me to continue to listen to this man's songs? Do I need to change my playlist so that I don't have this man's songs on it? That's the kind of question that the Donatists ask. But again, the answer in all of these cases is to remember that when God uses people, it's God using people. It's God's grace that comes through people. It's not people's grace. And so we don't have to reject God's grace when the means through which God gave us his grace reject God's grace. We may have to reject the people. I mean, I'm not sitting at the feet of Jerry Matitix or Scott Hahn anymore, nor would I want to. But I can still look back and say, this is what God did in my life through them. This is how God blessed my life through these men, and remain grateful to God for his grace in my life. I don't want to fall into that Donatist error. I want to be grateful to God's grace. Some of you were actually there and heard it happen. Many of you, I'm sure, have only seen it in the context of memes. I happened to be not only in the room, but on the stage with my father when he uttered the now famous words, "What's wrong with you people?" Well, as many of you that remember that, probably precious few of you remember what preceded that, why he said what he said. Well, what he said was in response to a question that essentially asked, what's the big deal about Adam and Eve eating a piece of fruit? Didn't God essentially overreact to that sin? That's what prompted my father to say, "What's wrong with you people?" And I understand why he did, and I actually agree with him. And in fact, the reality is that as I've been looking through and thinking about this series that I've been doing that I simply call Puzzlers, I have discerned a pattern. Not all of the puzzlers fall into this pattern, but a fair number of them do. The question, the thing that creates the puzzlement, is the reality of God's judgment. Not too long ago, we did a puzzler on the harem, on God's declaration that all the men, women, and children in the promised land should be put to death. And another one we looked at was why God didn't allow Moses to go to the promised land. So what we have here is, in fact, this is now going to be the third in a row, I believe, of puzzlers looking at, why is God doing this? And this third one may be the most difficult of all, but I pray and I trust that it will reveal the underlying error between the question that caused my dad to say, "What's wrong with you people?" and these three things. And the story I'd like us to consider is a story that my father has dealt with in the past. The story of Uzzah. As you may recall, there was a time in the life of God's people in the promised land where the tabernacle had not found a permanent home, much less had the temple been built. And there was also a time when the Ark of the Covenant, the sign of God's presence, was lost to the Philistines. Well, in one of the occasions where the Ark of the Covenant is being moved, we read the story of Uzzah the Kohathite. The Kohathites were a sub-branch of the Levites whose specific charge and task was taking care of the things in the tabernacle and later in the temple. Well, as this Ark of the Covenant is being moved from one place to another, it has been placed on a cart that's being drawn by a pair of oxen. And at one point, the oxen stumble, and it looked for a moment as if the Ark of the Covenant would fall off of the wagon that it was on and fall into the mud. And Uzzah, perhaps instinctively, without much thought, reached out his hand to steady the Ark of the Covenant and fell down dead. So Uzzah is trying to protect the ark from falling into the mud, and God determines to take his life. Well, why in the world would God do that? One could argue that they don't even see the sin, much less does the sin meet the punishment. Well, hopefully we understand that any sin, no matter how small, meets the punishment of death, because the wages of sin is death. It's not that only certain sins are worthy of death in God's eyes. And so from that perspective, then we're left, though, is this a sin? And if so, why? You've all been there, that kind of moment of instinct when something's in danger and you reach out. In fact, sometimes we have moments of great dexterity and heroism. And so is that what Uzzah is doing here? Well, we don't have to change the story to discern the answer. All we have to do is change our perspective on us, the Ark of the Covenant, and mud. You see, friends, as my father has been wont to put it, if the ark touches the mud, it is not besmirched. And if it touches a human, it is besmirched. You see, my father points out that mud is always obedient. Mud is always obedient. If you take some of the water out of the mud, it will become dirt. If you take more of the water out of the dirt, it will become dust. That's what it does. That's how it's made. It's always obedient. It never dishonors God. It never disobeys God. But humans, we do. And so Uzzah's problem was not just simply that he didn't take God seriously enough. He knew, by the way, having been trained, that he was not to touch the ark. And another part of the story that we may miss, he knew that an ox cart was not the way that God had determined the Ark of the Covenant should be moved. It had rings through which poles made of acacia wood were to be slid, and it was to be carried and not touched when it was moving from one place to another. So already there is a level of dishonoring and disobedience. But again, it's not just that. It is the misunderstanding of the nature of what we are and the nature of what dirt is. Uzzah is a much worse thing for the Ark of the Covenant to touch than dirt. Now, some of you may be familiar with this story. Some of you may be familiar with this assessment of the story because this comes right out of my father's book, The Holiness of God. Some of you may know that every Monday evening, we host here in our home, Lisa and I do, a Bible study. Currently, we're getting ready to finish up a study on the Apostles' Creed in a week or two. And when that's done, we're planning to start a new study in which we're going to go together through my father's book, The Holiness of God. Now, we not only have people in our home, and if you live nearby and want to come to that, you're welcome to. Or if you happen to be in the area and not live here, you're welcome to, as we've had guests of that nature before. Or you're all welcome to attend via the internet. And we'll make sure to have these posted at rcsproulJR.com, among other places, and accessible when we go live. So please consider tuning in as we work together through this classic book of my father's, The Holiness of God. Now more than ever, we need to learn, all of us, how to choose wisely our Twitter wars. Either works or it doesn't. Sometimes we really do have to pick our poison. Other times we find ourselves being roped into a false dilemma, an escape through a tertium quid, a third option. Joshua asked the captain of the Lord's hosts if he was for the children of Israel or for the children of Jericho. The captain of the Lord's hosts wisely answered, no. The war in Vietnam is no argument for pacifism. The failure of Chamberlain is no argument for waging aggressive war. We can be against this war, but not against all wars. We can be for that other war, but not for all wars. And so it is with Twitter wars. It is not my contention that we all have a duty, if we can't say something nice, to say nothing at all. It is my contention, however, that not every time some member of the Axis rattles his cyber saber, that it is the duty of every member of the Allies to rattle back and amass toy soldiers on the border. In fact, it may very well be that the best course of action is for all of us to keep our swords in their scabbards. My gratitude for the courage, the biblical insight, and the humility of Martin Luther knows no bounds. In a few months, we will be celebrating again his nailing of his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. But as we celebrate that, we would do well to remember that what he was not doing was starting a revolution. He simply sought to start a conversation. The fruit of those conversations eventually led to that watershed moment when all the power of Rome was allied against him, demanding at the imperial Diet of Worms, they dressed in their gaudy array and he in his monk's cowl, that he recant. And Martin Luther boldly responded, "May I have 24 hours to think about it?" It was only after a long night of intense prayer that Luther gave his "Here I stand, I can do no other" speech. We, on the other hand, we can't even be bothered to take the time to proofread before hurling our rhetorical grenades in the latest Twitter war. And generally speaking, the issues we fight are over molehills compared to Luther fighting over a mountain. Maybe, just maybe, Luther was cautious, slow to speak, where we are not, because he was facing the very real possibility of being put to death. Whereas the worst that can happen to us is we might lose a few followers. That, friends, that is just the problem. Because it is, quote, safe to be over the top in our assaults against others over the interwebs, we forget about our calling before God. That we not be contentious, that our speech be marked by grace, that we forget that a soft answer turns away wrath, that we forget that we will be known to be His children by our love one for another. We forget love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We forget that the very ones we are fighting against over secondary issues are those Jesus fights for. Indeed, the ones He died for. We forget that He came and was crucified for His bride, the second Eve, not for her ugly caricature, Big Eva. Lord, teach my hands to make peace, and teach me to pray. Here I kneel, I can do no other. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.